What would you do if your own husband dismissed your military service as just being a military wife, only to watch in shock as elite special forces officers stood at attention and saluted you at a dinner party? This is exactly what happened to Allison Patterson, and the moment that followed would change her marriage forever. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. Allison Patterson stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, adjusting the simple black dress she'd chosen for tonight's dinner party. Her husband Marcus was hosting his biggest potential client yet, David Richardson, CEO of Richardson Defense Contractors, and the pressure was suffocating. Marcus had been preparing for weeks, rehearsing his pitch, perfecting every detail of the evening. "Allison, are you almost ready?" Marcus called from the bedroom, his voice tight with anxiety. "The Richardsons will be here in 20 minutes, and I still need to set up the wine glasses properly." She smoothed down her hair and walked out to find Marcus frantically adjusting place settings on their dining room table. His marketing firm desperately needed this contract. Richardson Defense was worth millions, and landing them would secure Marcus's company for years to come. "Everything looks perfect," Allison said softly, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Marcus barely acknowledged her touch, too focused on folding napkins with military precision. "I just need everything to go smoothly tonight." Richardson is ex-Navy, very traditional, very particular about respect and hierarchy. "I've done my research. He values people who understand military culture." Allison's jaw tightened slightly. She understood military culture better than Marcus could ever imagine, but she'd learned years ago that her husband preferred when she stayed quietly in the background during his business dinners. He'd made it clear that her role was to be the perfect hostess, charming, supportive, but not too involved in the serious conversations. The doorbell rang at exactly 7 o'clock. Marcus straightened his tie one final time before opening the door to reveal David Richardson and his wife, Catherine. Richardson was a tall, imposing man in his 50s, with steel gray hair and the kind of posture that screamed former military officer. Catherine was elegant and warm, immediately embracing Allison with genuine friendliness. "David, Catherine, welcome to our home," Marcus said, his business smile perfectly calibrated. "Please, come in. Can I get you both something to drink?" As they settled in the living room with cocktails, Marcus launched into his carefully prepared conversation starters. He talked about his respect for military service, his company's commitment to supporting defense contractors, and his deep appreciation for the sacrifices military families make. "It's so important to honor those who serve," Marcus said, gesturing toward Allison. "My wife here knows all about military life. She's a military wife herself, spent years supporting our troops from the home front." Allison's grip tightened on her wine glass. The phrase military wife always made her skin crawl when Marcus used it. Not because there was anything wrong with being a military spouse. Those men and women deserve tremendous respect for their sacrifices. But because Marcus used it to diminish her own service, to erase her identity and reduce her to just a supportive background figure. David Richardson's eyebrows raised slightly. "Oh, which branch did your husband serve in?" An awkward silence filled the room. Marcus shifted uncomfortably, clearly realizing he'd backed himself into a corner. "Well, actually, I didn't serve myself. But Allison's first husband was military, so she has that experience." It was a lie, and Allison felt her face flush with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. Her first husband, James, had been a civilian contractor. He'd died in a car accident 3 years into their marriage, long before she'd even met Marcus. But Marcus had constructed this convenient fiction to explain away her knowledge of military protocol and her occasional slips into military terminology. Catherine Richardson leaned forward with interest. "That must have been challenging, dealing with deployments in military life. Which base were you stationed at?" Allison opened her mouth to speak, but Marcus jumped in quickly. "Oh, you know how it is with military wives. They move around so much it's hard to keep track of all the different bases." He laughed nervously. "Allison's always been modest about her experiences. She doesn't like to talk about that time in her life." David Richardson nodded knowingly. "I understand completely. Military spouses carry their own burden of service. the strength it takes to hold down the home front while your partner is deployed. That's its own form of heroism. Marcus beamed, clearly pleased that his fabrication was being well received. Exactly. Allison always says the real heroes are the ones who serve, not the families who support them. She's very humble about her contribution. Quote, Allison excused herself to check on dinner. Needing a moment to compose herself in the kitchen, she gripped the granite countertop, breathing deeply. Marcus's lies were getting more elaborate each time he told this story. What had started as a simple misunderstanding had snowballed into a complete fictional narrative about her past. The truth was far more complicated. Allison had served 12 years in the Army, rising to the rank of lieutenant colonel. She'd commanded a combat support battalion, deployed twice to Afghanistan, and earned a Bronze Star for her leadership during a particularly dangerous mission. She'd left the service reluctantly when her father was diagnosed with Alzheimer's and needed full-time care. But Marcus didn't know any of this. When they'd met at a coffee shop 4 years ago, she'd been working as a consultant for veteran services organizations, keeping her military background professionally relevant but personally private. She'd been tired of being defined by her service, tired of people either treating her like a hero or questioning whether she'd seen real combat as a woman in the military. Marcus had seemed different at first. He'd been attracted to her intelligence and confidence without needing to know where it came from. She'd planned to tell him about her service once their relationship grew more serious, but somehow the right moment never came. And then Marcus started making assumptions about her knowledge of military culture, creating his own explanations for her familiarity with protocol and terminology. By the time she realized how deeply invested he was in his version of her story, they were engaged. She'd tried to correct him several times, but Marcus had a way of dismissing her attempts at honesty as modesty or trauma-induced reluctance to discuss her difficult past as a military spouse. The irony was crushing. Marcus desperately wanted to impress clients with military connections, constantly name-dropping his quote, military wife to establish credibility, while simultaneously erasing her actual service and reducing her to a supporting character in someone else's story. She could hear Marcus in the dining room, still spinning tales about her fictional first marriage to a deployed soldier. He was describing imaginary struggles she'd never faced, imaginary bases she'd never lived on, imaginary sacrifices she'd never made as a spouse. Meanwhile, her real sacrifices, the years she'd spent in harm's way, the soldiers she'd led, the genuine hardships she'd endured in service to her country, remained completely invisible. Dinner conversation continued in the same vein. Marcus held court, playing the role of the supportive second husband who'd helped his wife heal from the trauma of military life. He spoke about her adjustment issues and her reluctance to attend military ceremonies because they brought back difficult memories. David and Catherine Richardson listened with the polite attention of people who respected military service but had heard similar stories many times before. They were kind to Allison, treating her with the gentle deference often shown to military spouses who'd endured multiple deployments and family separations. The transition back to civilian life can be so challenging, Catherine said sympathetically, even for spouses. You're constantly adapting to new situations, new communities. Allison nodded politely, though every word felt like another layer of erasure. She wasn't struggling with transition. She was thriving in her consulting work, using her military experience to help other veterans navigate their own career changes. But Marcus's narrative required her to be fragile, damaged, someone who needed protection from painful memories, rather than someone who'd earned those memories through her own courage and leadership. As the evening progressed, Allison found herself retreating further into silence. Every attempt to contribute to the conversation was either interrupted by Marcus or steered back to his fictional version of her story. She watched her husband perform for the Richardsons, using her fabricated past as a prop in his business pitch, and felt something fundamental shift inside her. She'd been complicit in this deception for too long, allowing Marcus to rewrite her history because it seemed easier than confronting the complex truth of who she really was. But sitting at her own dinner table, listening to her husband profit from lies about her service, while her real achievements remained invisible, she realized the cost of her silence had become unbearable. The Richardsons were good people who genuinely respected military service, They deserved honesty, not Marcus's carefully constructed fiction. And she deserved to be seen for who she really was, not dismissed as merely someone's wife, especially when that dismissal came from the man who was supposed to love and support her unconditionally. As Marcus launched into another elaborate story about her supposed struggles with military spouse life, Allison made a decision that would change everything. She was done being erased from her own story. The main course arrived without incident, and Allison served the perfectly prepared salmon while Marcus continued his performance. He'd moved on from discussing her fictional military spouse experience to talking about his company's innovative marketing strategies for defense contractors. The key is understanding the military mindset, Marcus explained, cutting into his fish with theatrical precision. Honor, duty, commitment. These aren't just words to people in the defense industry, they're core values that drive every decision. David Richardson nodded approvingly. That's exactly right. Too many civilian companies try to work with military clients without understanding the culture. They think it's just another business transaction. Precisely, Marcus said, warming to his theme. That's why having Allison's perspective has been so valuable to my approach. She understands the sacrifices, the dedication required. It gives me insight into what really matters to military families. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Allison set down her fork, unable to take another bite. Marcus was using her again, spinning her non-existent experience as a military spouse into business credibility. But what made it worse was how genuinely impressed the Richardsons seemed by his supposed sensitivity to military culture. Catherine turned to Allison with renewed interest. It must be wonderful to have a husband who truly appreciates what you went through. So many civilian men don't understand the unique challenges military spouses face. Marcus is very supportive, Allison managed, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. I imagine the uncertainty was the hardest part, David said. Never knowing when orders might come through, when your husband might be deployed. The constant relocations must have been exhausting. Marcus jumped in before Allison could respond. She's incredibly resilient. I've watched her handle stress that would break most people. It's that military spouse's strength. They learn to adapt to anything. The conversation shifted to Marcus's business proposal, and Allison found herself studying the Richardsons more carefully. David had the bearing of someone who'd held real command. The kind of quiet confidence that came from making life and death decisions. His questions about Marcus's marketing strategies were probing but fair, testing whether Marcus truly understood the defense industry or was just another civilian trying to cash in on military contracts. What's your experience with classified projects? David asked. Many of our contracts involve sensitive materials that require security clearances. Marcus hesitated for just a moment too long. Well, I don't have a clearance myself, but I understand the importance of operational security. Allison has helped me understand some of the protocols around sensitive information. It was another lie built on the foundation of his fictional version of her past. Marcus had no idea that Allison held a top-secret clearance that was still active through her consulting work. He'd constructed an elaborate fantasy where her imaginary first husband had shared classified information inappropriately, giving her second-hand knowledge of military protocols. Security clearances aren't transferable, David said carefully. And military personnel are trained never to discuss classified information with family members, regardless of their clearance status. Allison watched Marcus's face flush slightly as he realized his mistake. Of course, you're absolutely right. I meant more general protocol knowledge, the importance of discretion, that sort of thing. The awkward moment passed, but Allison could see David making mental notes. Marcus's lack of genuine military understanding was becoming apparent despite his elaborate stories about her background. The very lies he'd constructed to impress the Richardsons were undermining his credibility. Have you considered bringing in consultants with actual security clearances? Catherine asked. There are several firms run by former military officers who specialize in helping civilian companies navigate defense contracts. That's an interesting idea, Marcus said, clearly scrambling. Though I found that having someone close to the process, someone who's lived the military lifestyle, provides a different kind of insight. Allison felt something snap inside her. Marcus was doubling down on his lies. using her fabricated past to dismiss the legitimate suggestion that he hire actual qualified consultants. He was so invested in his fiction that he couldn't see how it was sabotaging his own business opportunity. David raises a good point, Allison said quietly, her voice cutting through Marcus's rambling explanation. Direct military experience is irreplaceable. Marcus shot her a warning look, clearly expecting her to support his narrative. Well, yes, but as I was saying... No, Allison interrupted, her voice growing stronger. I think we should be honest about expertise. There's a significant difference between understanding military culture through personal experience and learning about it secondhand. The table fell silent. Catherine and David exchanged glances, sensing undercurrents they couldn't quite identify. Marcus stared at Allison with a mixture of confusion and growing alarm. Darling, Marcus said carefully, I think what you're trying to say is that authentic experience matters, which is exactly my point about your background giving us unique insight. My background, Allison repeated slowly. Tell me, Marcus, what exactly do you think my background is? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus's confident facade began to crack as he realized he'd backed himself into a corner. The Richardsons watched with the polite attention of people witnessing a domestic disagreement they'd rather not be part of. Your first marriage, Marcus said hesitantly. The challenges you faced as a military wife. The deployments, the relocations. Which deployments? Allison asked, her voice dangerously quiet. Which bases? What was my first husband's rank, his unit, his specialty? Marcus opened and closed his mouth like a fish, gasping for air. He'd never bothered to learn the details of the story he'd been telling for years. His version of her past was all broad strokes and emotional manipulation, designed to evoke sympathy rather than provide specific information. You've always said you prefer not to discuss the specifics, Marcus stammered, that it brings back difficult memories. No, Allison said, setting down her napkin with deliberate precision. You've always said I prefer not to discuss specifics. You've created an entire narrative about my reluctance to share details of a military experience that never happened. David Richardson leaned forward slightly, his intelligence officer instincts clearly engaged. Catherine's eyes widened as she began to understand what was unfolding. Allison, Marcus said desperately, this isn't the time or place. When is the time? She demanded. When is the place to discuss the fact that you've been lying about my service for 4 years? That you've built your entire approach to military clients on fabricated stories about my experience as a military spouse? Your service? David asked quietly, his tone sharp with sudden interest. Marcus looked between them frantically. She means her service as a supportive spouse? The service that military families provide on the home front. No, Allison said, her voice cutting through his desperate explanations. I mean my 12 years of active duty in the United States Army, my deployments to Afghanistan, my command of a combat support battalion, my Bronze Star, my security clearance, my actual service. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus's face went white as the full scope of his misunderstanding crashed down on him. The Richardsons stared at Allison with new recognition, their earlier polite sympathy replaced by genuine respect and growing outrage at Marcus's deception. You're telling me, David said slowly, that you're a veteran, a combat veteran, and your husband has been introducing you as a military spouse? Quote. Not just introducing me, Allison said bitterly, profiting from lies about my supposed struggles as a military wife while completely erasing my actual service, using fabricated stories about my trauma and adjustment issues to build credibility with clients like you. Catherine's expression had shifted from sympathy to fury. You let him do this? You let him lie about your service, diminish your achievements, turn you into some kind of tragic figure who needs protection from her own memories? The accusation hit like a physical blow. Allison had been complicit in Marcus's deception through her silence, allowing him to construct his elaborate fiction because confronting the truth seemed too complicated, too difficult. I tried to tell him, she said weakly, but he'd already decided who I was, what my story should be. And I was tired of being defined by my service, tired of people's reactions when they learned about my military background. So you let him define you instead, David said, his voice heavy with disappointment. You let a civilian who's never served erase your sacrifice and turn it into his business advantage. Marcus finally found his voice. I didn't know, he said desperately. She never told me the truth. How was I supposed to know she'd actually served? You were supposed to ask, Catherine snapped. You were supposed to listen to your wife instead of creating comfortable fictions about her past. The dinner party was disintegrating before their eyes, 4 years of lies and misunderstandings finally exploding into the open. But for the first time in years, Allison felt like she could breathe. David Richardson pushed back from the table, his businessman's composure replaced by the stern authority of a former naval officer. Lieutenant Colonel Patterson, I believe we need to start this conversation over. The formal address hit Marcus like a slap. He stared at his wife as if seeing her for the first time, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. The title carried weight that his fictional military spouse narrative never could. Lieutenant Colonel wasn't a rank you stumbled into or inherited through marriage. 12 years active duty, David continued, his tone now carrying the respect due a fellow officer. Combat deployments. Battalion command. You outrank most of the officers I served with. Allison straightened unconsciously, her military bearing becoming visible for the first time all evening. The subtle shift in her posture was unmistakable to anyone who'd spent time around career military personnel. Thank you, sir, she said simply. Catherine was staring at Marcus with undisguised disgust. You've been parading around, using your wife's fabricated trauma as a business tool, while she's a decorated combat veteran, sitting right next to you. Do you have any idea how insulting that is? Marcus finally found his voice, though it came out as a strangled whisper. Combat veteran? Allison, you said you worked in logistics. I commanded a combat support battalion, Allison corrected. We provided logistics, maintenance, and supply operations in forward operating bases. We came under fire regularly. We lost people. Her voice remained steady, but there was steel underneath. I earned my Bronze Star when our convoy was ambushed, and I led the defense that saved 17 soldiers. The color drained from Marcus's face completely. His carefully constructed world was crumbling, revealing just how little he actually knew about the woman he'd married. David leaned forward, his expression intense. Which FOB? Which deployment? FOB Chapman, 2018 to 2019, Allison answered, without hesitation. Before that, FOB Shank from 2015 to 2016. Chapman, David repeated, recognition flickering in his eyes. I know officers who served there. Tough assignment. The supply lines were constantly under threat. We adapted, Allison said simply. Lost some good people, but we kept the base operational. Catherine turned to Marcus, her voice sharp with anger. While your wife was dodging Taliban rockets and keeping soldiers fed and supplied, you've been spinning fairy tales about her struggling to cope with her husband's deployments. Deployments she never experienced because she was the one deployed. Marcus looked like he might be sick. I thought, when you knew so much about military protocol, when you corrected my pronunciation of military terms, I assumed. You assumed I learned it from a husband, Allison finished. It never occurred to you that I might have learned it by living it myself. But you never corrected me, Marcus said desperately. When I told people about your first husband's service, you never said anything. I tried, Allison said, her composure finally cracking. I tried multiple times to tell you the truth, but you had already decided who I was. Every time I started to explain my actual service, you'd pat my hand and tell me I didn't need to relive those painful memories of being left behind. David's expression had shifted to something approaching fury. You silenced a combat veteran. You literally prevented her from sharing her own service record because it didn't fit your preferred narrative. The weight of his actions was finally hitting Marcus. He'd spent 4 years systematically erasing his wife's military achievements, replacing them with a fictional story that served his business interests, while diminishing her actual sacrifice. The consulting work, Marcus said suddenly, pieces clicking into place. Your security clearance. The veteran organizations you work with. Oh God, Allison, what have I done? You've spent 4 years profiting from lies about my service while hiding my real accomplishments, she said quietly. You've used fabricated stories about my trauma to build credibility with military clients while ensuring that my actual expertise remained invisible. Catherine shook her head in disbelief. I've never seen anything like this. You've been married for 4 years and you didn't know your wife was a combat veteran? She kept it private, Marcus said weakly. She said she didn't like to talk about her military experience. Because every time she tried, you turned it into a story about someone else's service, David said harshly. You were so invested in your version of her past that you couldn't hear what she was actually trying to tell you. Allison stood abruptly, needing space to process the emotional whiplash of finally having her service acknowledged after years of erasure. She walked to the window, looking out at their quiet suburban street, so different from the dusty forward operating bases where she'd spent some of the most meaningful years of her life. The irony, she said without turning around, is that you desperately wanted military credibility for your business, but you were married to someone who could have given you legitimate expertise. Instead, you chose comfortable lies. Marcus was crying now, ugly sobs that shook his whole body. I'm so sorry, I didn't know. I thought I was being supportive, protecting you from painful memories. Whose painful memories? Allison asked, turning back to face him. You created an entire fictional trauma narrative for me. A dead husband I never had, deployments I never endured as a spouse, struggles with military life that belonged to someone else entirely. I wanted to understand you, Marcus said through his tears. When we met, you seemed to carry this weight, this knowledge of military life. I thought I was helping by not pushing for details. You weren't helping, David said bluntly. You were projecting. You created a story that made you comfortable, that fit your preconceptions about military spouses. And you forced your wife to live inside that fiction. Catherine stood and moved to Allison's side, placing a supportive hand on her arm. How long have you been carrying this alone? 4 years, Allison said. 4 years of watching my husband use fabricated stories about my supposed struggles to impress military clients, while my actual service record gathered dust. And tonight was the last straw, David observed. Allison nodded. Listening to him spin tales about my fictional first husband's deployment while describing my imaginary adjustment issues. I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't let him profit from lies about military service while my own sacrifices remained invisible. Marcus looked up from the table, his face blotchy and desperate. What can I do? How can I fix this? You can start by telling the truth, Catherine said firmly. To your clients, to your friends, to everyone who's heard your fabricated stories about Allison's past. But the business, Marcus said weakly, the Richardson contract. David's expression hardened. Are you seriously worried about your business deal right now, after what you've just learned about what you've done to your wife? The question hung in the air like an indictment. Marcus's immediate concern for his business prospects, even in the face of his massive betrayal of Allison's service, revealed everything about his priorities. The contract is off the table, David said definitively. Richardson Defense doesn't work with companies built on lies about military service. What you've done isn't just dishonest. It's a fundamental disrespect to everyone who's worn the uniform. Marcus's business dreams collapsed with those words, but Allison felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Validation. For the first time since she'd met Marcus, someone was treating her service with the respect it deserved. Lieutenant Colonel, David said, addressing her formally again. If you're ever interested in consulting work with defense contractors, I'd be honored to discuss opportunities. We need people with your background and integrity. The offer was professional recognition she'd been denied for years, acknowledgement of her expertise rather than dismissal of her fictional trauma. But more than that, it was proof that her service mattered, that her sacrifices had value beyond Marcus's comfortable lies. As the evening crashed to its inevitable conclusion, Allison realized that Marcus's deception had cost them both far more than he could ever understand. He'd lost his business opportunity and revealed the shallow foundation of their marriage. But she'd lost 4 years of living authentically, 4 years of having her service honored rather than erased. The dinner party was over, but the real reckoning was just beginning. The Richardsons left within the hour, their departure marked by a firm handshake between David and Allison, officer to officer, and a cold nod toward Marcus. Catherine pressed a business card into Allison's hand, with a whispered invitation to lunch, woman to woman, veteran to civilian ally. The silence that followed their departure was deafening. Marcus sat slumped at the dining table, surrounded by the remnants of his failed dinner party, while Allison methodically cleared plates with mechanical precision. The mundane act of cleaning up felt surreal after the emotional earthquake that had just shattered their marriage. "Say something," Marcus finally pleaded. "Scream at me. Throw something. Just don't shut me out like this." Allison paused, holding a stack of dinner plates, considering his request. "What would you like me to say, Marcus? That it's okay you've been lying about my service for 4 years? That I understand why you found it easier to invent a dead husband than to acknowledge my actual achievements?" "I never meant to hurt you," he said desperately. "I thought I was being sensitive to your privacy." She set the plates down carefully, her military training keeping her movements controlled even as her emotions churned. "Privacy? You turned my life into a public performance. Every business dinner, every client meeting, every social gathering where you drag out your military spouse stories. There was nothing private about what you did." Marcus flinched as if she'd struck him. "I was trying to honor military families. I thought I was showing respect. By fabricating trauma I never experienced? By describing struggles I never faced?" Allison's voice remained steady, but the undercurrent of rage was unmistakable. "You honored nothing, Marcus. You used fictional military suffering as a business tool." The truth of her words seemed to physically pain him. He doubled over as if she'd punched him in the stomach. "The consulting work you do with veteran organizations. How long have they known? About my service record? From day one." She moved to the kitchen, needing distance from his stricken expression. "It's kind of hard to help other veterans transition to civilian careers when you haven't done it yourself. But you never talk about deployments at home. You never mention combat experiences." Allison turned to face him, her patience finally fraying. "Because every time I tried, you'd cut me off with stories about how brave military spouses are, how much they sacrifice for their deployed husbands. You made it impossible to share my actual experiences because you'd already decided what my experiences should be." The kitchen counter stood between them like a battlefield, marked by years of conversations that never happened, truths that were never shared, understanding that was never reached. "The nightmares," Marcus said suddenly. "Sometimes you have nightmares. I assumed they were about losing your first husband, about the stress of military life." "They're about Afghanistan," she said quietly. "About soldiers I couldn't save. About decisions I made under fire. About carrying responsibility for other people's lives when I was barely old enough to understand what that meant." Marcus absorbed this revelation like a physical blow. The woman he'd married, the woman he'd reduced to a supporting character in someone else's military story, had carried command responsibility in a combat zone. She'd made life-and-death decisions while he was attending marketing conferences and networking events. "You could have corrected me," he said weakly, grasping for any way to shift responsibility. "You could have insisted on telling me the truth." "I tried," Allison repeated, her voice hard as steel. "But you were so invested in your version of my story that you wouldn't hear anything else. Every time I mentioned my deployment, you'd pat my hand and change the subject to spare me from reliving the trauma of being left behind. I thought I was protecting you. From what? From being seen as I actually am instead of who you needed me to be?" She gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles white. "You weren't protecting me, Marcus. You were protecting yourself from having to deal with a wife who might be stronger than you, more accomplished than you, more respected than you." The accusation hung between them, brutal in its accuracy. Marcus had constructed his military spouse narrative not just to impress clients, but to maintain a comfortable power dynamic in their marriage. A traumatized military wife needed his protection and support. A decorated combat veteran might outshine him. "That's not true," he protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "Isn't it? When was the last time you introduced me by my actual achievements? When did you ever mention my consulting work, my security clearance, my expertise in veteran affairs?" Allison's composure was cracking. Years of suppressed frustration finally breaking through. "You've spent 4 years making me invisible while using fabricated stories about my supposed weakness to advance your career." Marcus tried to stand, reaching toward her, But she stepped back sharply. The rejection was physical and immediate, a clear boundary drawn after years of boundary violations. "Don't," she said firmly. "Don't touch me right now. Don't try to comfort me from the trauma you invented. Don't try to soothe pain you've been inflicting for years." He sank back into his chair, finally understanding the magnitude of what he'd destroyed. The woman he'd married was a combat veteran with a distinguished service record, and he'd spent their entire relationship systematically erasing her identity to serve his own needs. "The Bronze Star," he said suddenly. "Where is it? I've never seen any of your military awards." "In a box in the attic," Allison said bitterly. "Along with my promotion certificates, my combat patches, my deployment photos. All the physical evidence of 12 years of service that didn't fit your preferred narrative about my past." The image of her military honors, hidden away in an attic box, was devastating. Marcus had created an environment where his wife felt compelled to hide her greatest achievements, to lock away the proudest moments of her professional life, because they contradicted his comfortable fiction. "I want to see them," he said desperately. "I want to understand what I missed, what I ignored." "Now you want to see them?" Allison's laugh was sharp and humorless. "After 4 years of marriage, after tonight's humiliation, now you're curious about my actual service record?" "I'm trying to fix this," Marcus said, his voice breaking. "I'm trying to understand how I got everything so wrong." "You got it wrong because you never bothered to listen," she said with finality. "You created a story that served your purposes, and you forced me to live inside it. You turned my military service into your business advantage, while making sure my actual achievements remained invisible." The full scope of his betrayal was finally clear. Marcus had spent years profiting from lies about military service, while married to someone whose real service record could have provided genuine expertise. He'd hidden her light under a bushel of fabricated trauma stories, all while claiming to honor military families. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. Allison looked at him across the kitchen counter, seeing clearly for the first time the man she'd married. He was smaller than she'd remembered, diminished by his deception and his desperate need to control her narrative. The confident businessman who charmed her 4 years ago had revealed himself to be someone who couldn't handle being married to someone more accomplished than himself. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I need time to think, time to figure out who I am when I'm not hiding inside your fictional version of my life." "Are you leaving me?" The question she'd been avoiding all evening finally hung between them. Marcus had damaged their marriage in ways that went far beyond simple dishonesty. He'd committed a fundamental betrayal of her identity, her service, her very sense of self. "I'm going to stay at my sister's house for a few days," she said finally. "I need space to process what you've done, what I've allowed you to do." "But we can fix this," Marcus said desperately. "I can tell everyone the truth. I can make this right." Allison studied his face, seeing the panic there, the fear of losing not just his wife but his comfortable fiction about their relationship. Even now, facing the wreckage of his deception, he was thinking about damage control rather than the deeper issues that had led to this moment. "Can you?" she asked quietly. "Can you really fix 4 years of systematic erasure? Can you undo the damage to my professional reputation? The opportunities I lost because you insisted on keeping my expertise hidden? Can you give me back the years I spent hiding my service record to accommodate your lies?" The questions hit him like physical blows, each one driving home the irreversible nature of what he'd done. This wasn't a simple misunderstanding that could be cleared up with an apology and a correction. This was a fundamental betrayal that had shaped years of their marriage and countless professional interactions. "I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you," he promised desperately. Allison picked up her purse and car keys, her movements deliberate and final. "The rest of your life might not be long enough, Marcus, and it might not be something you get to spend with me." She walked toward the door, leaving him alone with the wreckage of his lies and the devastating understanding of what he'd lost through his own selfishness and insecurity. 3 days at her sister Jennifer's house gave Allison the clarity she desperately needed. Jennifer, a civilian nurse who'd always respected Allison's military service, was furious when she learned what Marcus had been doing. "He's been what?" Jennifer had exploded when Allison explained the situation. For 4 years? And you let him? The accusation stung because it contained truth. Allison had been complicit through her silence, allowing Marcus to construct his elaborate fiction rather than demanding he acknowledge her reality. But sitting in Jennifer's spare bedroom, surrounded by photos of her sister's family and achievements proudly displayed on every surface, Allison began to understand the toxic dynamic she'd been living in. Marcus called constantly. His voicemails progressed from desperate apologies to elaborate plans for making amends. He'd found her military records online, he said. He'd researched her deployments, her unit, her commanding officers. He wanted to understand everything he'd missed, everything he'd ignored. But his frantic research felt like another violation. He was trying to learn about her service from Google searches and military databases rather than from her own words, her own experiences. Even in his attempts at reconciliation, he was seeking external validation rather than listening to her voice. The breakthrough came on Thursday morning when David Richardson called her directly. "Lieutenant Colonel Patterson," his voice was crisp and professional over the phone. "I hope you don't mind me reaching out," Catherine insisted I call. "Not at all, sir. Thank you for the other night, for seeing me." Quote, "What your husband did was unconscionable," David said bluntly, "but what impressed me was your composure under fire. You handled that situation with the kind of leadership I'd expect from someone with your background." The praise felt foreign, after years of being treated as fragile. "Thank you, sir. I meant what I said about consulting opportunities. We're looking for someone with your specific expertise to help us navigate some sensitive veteran outreach programs. The pay is excellent, and it would put your skills to proper use." Allison closed her eyes, feeling something she hadn't experienced in years: professional recognition. "I'd be very interested in discussing that." "Good, but I have to ask, what's your situation with your husband? This kind of work requires absolute integrity. We can't have any more fabricated military backgrounds in our orbit." The question forced her to confront the decision she'd been avoiding. "I'm still sorting that out, sir, but I can promise you complete honesty about my service record and my personal situation. That's all I need to hear. Can you come in Monday morning? Let's discuss making this official." After hanging up, Allison sat in Jennifer's kitchen, staring at her phone. A legitimate job offer, based on her actual qualifications, her real service record, her genuine expertise. It was everything Marcus's lies had prevented her from accessing for years. When Marcus called that afternoon, she finally answered. "Allison, thank God," his voice was rough with exhaustion. "I've been researching everything. Your Bronze Star citation, the action at Phoebe Chapman. I found articles about your battalion, interviews with soldiers who served under your command. Why didn't you ever tell me about Sergeant Collins?" She felt her chest tighten. Sergeant Rebecca Collins had been killed in the ambush that earned Allison her Bronze Star. The young soldier had been under Allison's command, under her protection, and Allison had carried that loss for years. "Don't," she said sharply. "Don't you dare try to research my trauma like it's a business proposal. I'm trying to understand." "You're trying to Google your way into empathy," she cut him off. "You're treating my service record like a Wikipedia article you can memorize instead of a lived experience you should have respected." There was silence on the other end of the line. Then Marcus's voice, smaller than she'd ever heard it. "I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to make you trust me again." "Maybe you can't," Allison said quietly. "Maybe some things can't be fixed with research and good intentions." "So that's it? 4 years of marriage, and you're just giving up?" The accusation in his voice sparked her anger. "I'm giving up? Marcus, you gave up on our marriage the day you decided your fictional version of my life was more convenient than the truth. You gave up every time you silenced me when I tried to share my actual experiences. I never silenced you. Every pat on the hand. You don't need to relive those painful memories. Every time you steered conversation away from my actual service to protect me from trauma I didn't have." Her voice was steady but furious. "You systematically silenced me for 4 years. Marcus was crying again, ugly sobs that made her feel both pity and revulsion. "I love you. I know I screwed up, but I love you. You love your version of me, she corrected. You love the damaged military spouse who needed your protection. You love the woman whose fabricated trauma made you feel important and gave you business credibility. But you've never loved the actual me. That's not true. When did you ever ask about my soldiers? When did you want to know about the missions I led, the decisions I made, the lives I was responsible for? The questions tumbled out, years of suppressed need for recognition finally breaking free. When did you ever express pride in my achievements instead of using fictional trauma to advance your career? The silence stretched between them. Answer enough. I'm filing for divorce, she said finally. Allison, please. I've already spoken to a lawyer. Jennifer's husband recommended someone who specializes in military divorce cases. Apparently, there are specific provisions for situations involving the misrepresentation of military service. You're destroying our marriage over a misunderstanding. I'm ending a marriage that was built on lies, she corrected. A marriage where my identity was systematically erased to serve your needs. A marriage where my greatest achievements were hidden in an attic box while you profited from fabricated stories about my supposed weakness. Marcus made a choking sound that might have been a sob or a gasp. What about our life together? What about everything we built? What did we build, Marcus? A house where I couldn't display my military honors? A social circle where I had to pretend to be someone I'm not? A marriage where my husband introduced me as a tragic figure instead of a decorated veteran? I can change. I can learn to see you differently. It's too late for that, she said with finality. You've had 4 years to see me. You chose not to. You chose comfortable lies over inconvenient truths, and now you're facing the consequences. The business is ruined, he said desperately. Richardson was my biggest potential client. Word is already spreading about what happened. I'm losing everything. Good, she said without sympathy. You built that business on lies about military service. You deserve to lose it. How can you be so cold? The question almost made her laugh. Cold? Marcus, I spent 12 years in the Army learning to make hard decisions under pressure. I learned to prioritize mission accomplishment over personal comfort. Right now, my mission is rebuilding a life where I can be seen and respected for who I actually am. And I'm not part of that mission. You're the obstacle I'm removing. The brutal honesty of her words seemed to finally penetrate his denial. For the first time since the dinner party disaster, Marcus seemed to understand that this wasn't a temporary setback that could be fixed with apologies and research. This was the end of their marriage, the natural consequence of years of systematic dishonesty and erasure. I never meant for any of this to happen, he said weakly. Intent doesn't matter, Allison replied with military directness. Results matter. And the result of your actions is the destruction of any trust or respect I might have had for you. She hung up without saying goodbye, feeling lighter than she had in years. The marriage was over, but for the first time since she'd met Marcus, she could see a future where she might be truly known and valued for who she was, rather than who someone else needed her to be. Monday morning, she would walk into Richardson Defense as Lieutenant Colonel Allison Patterson, bringing her real expertise and authentic experience to work that actually mattered. The woman who had commanded soldiers in combat zones would finally stop hiding behind someone else's comfortable fiction. The real Allison Patterson was about to reclaim her life. 6 months later, Allison Patterson stood in her new office at Richardson Defense, adjusting the bronze star that now hung proudly on her wall alongside her deployment photos and unit citations. The attic box had been emptied, its contents finally displayed where they belonged, in a place of honor that reflected 12 years of distinguished service. The divorce had been finalized the previous month. Marcus had contested it initially, hiring an expensive lawyer who specialized in, quote, saving marriages destroyed by misunderstandings. But when the attorney learned the specifics of the case, 4 years of systematic misrepresentation of military service for business gain, he'd quietly advised Marcus to accept Allison's terms and consider himself lucky she wasn't pursuing legal action for fraud. The house had been sold, with Allison using her portion of the proceeds to buy a downtown condo that felt more like home than anywhere she'd lived since leaving the Army. Clean lines, modern fixtures, and walls covered with authentic memories instead of hidden shame. Her work at Richardson Defense had exceeded everyone's expectations. Her first project involved developing outreach programs for transitioning veterans, drawing on her own experience and extensive network within the military community. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was now professionally helping other veterans do what Marcus had prevented her from doing, transitioning successfully while maintaining pride in their service. "Lieutenant Colonel, do you have a moment?" David Richardson appeared in her doorway, his expression serious but not unfriendly. "Of course, sir. What can I do for you?" He stepped into her office, closing the door behind him. "I wanted to discuss the Morrison Industries proposal. They're requesting our services for a major defense contract, but there's a complication." Allison gestured to the chair across from her desk. "What kind of complication?" "The marketing firm they've hired to handle the civilian outreach component," David said carefully. "It's run by your ex-husband." The words hit her like a physical blow. Marcus's business had indeed suffered after the dinner party disaster, but apparently he'd managed to rebuild enough to land a significant contract. The thought of working in any capacity with the man who'd spent years erasing her service made her stomach turn. "I see," she said, keeping her voice professional despite the emotional turmoil. "What are your thoughts on how to proceed?" "That's entirely up to you," David said. "Morrison Industries specifically requested you for this project based on your reputation in the veteran community. But I won't put you in a position where you have to work with Marcus if that's uncomfortable." Allison stared out her office window, watching traffic move through downtown. The professional side of her recognized that the Morrison contract was exactly the kind of high-profile project that could establish Richardson Defense as the premier firm for veteran outreach programs. Walking away because of personal history would be letting her past dictate her future. "Has Marcus indicated whether he knows I'm involved?" she asked. According to Morrison, he specifically mentioned his expertise in military culture gained through his former marriage to a quote, decorated Army veteran, David said with barely concealed disgust. "He's apparently learned to tell a version of the truth that serves his purposes." The revelation was both infuriating and unsurprising. Marcus was still using her service for business advantage, but now he was acknowledging her actual rank and achievements instead of fabricating trauma stories. It was progress of a sort, but it still felt like exploitation. "He's monetizing the truth this time instead of lies," Allison said bitterly. "I suppose that's an improvement. The question is whether you want to confront him directly, or if we should find a way to structure the project so you don't have to interact." Before Allison could answer, her assistant knocked on the door. "Excuse me, Lieutenant Colonel Patterson, but there's Marcus Fleming here to see you. He says it's urgent and relates to the Morrison Industries contract." David raised an eyebrow. "Speak of the devil. Do you want me to have security escort him out?" Allison considered the offer. It would be easy to hide behind corporate protocol, to avoid the confrontation entirely. But 6 months of therapy and professional success had given her confidence she hadn't possessed during their marriage. She was no longer the woman who allowed herself to be silenced or erased. "No," she said decisively. "Send him in, but stay if you don't mind, sir. I'd prefer to have a witness to whatever he's planning to say." Marcus entered her office looking like a different man. Gone was the confident businessman's swagger she remembered. He appeared thinner, older, worn down by the consequences of his deception. His eyes widened when he saw her Bronze Star prominently displayed, her deployment photos covering one wall, her military certificates arranged in perfect order. "Allison," he said quietly, "thank you for seeing me." "It's Lieutenant Colonel Patterson," she corrected firmly, "and this is my boss, David Richardson. You remember him from dinner." Marcus flinched at the reference to that disastrous evening. "Mr. Richardson, I owe you an apology as well." "You owe me nothing," David said coldly. "You owe your ex-wife a debt you'll never be able to repay." "That's why I'm here," Marcus said, turning back to Allison. "I know about the Morrison contract. I know they want you specifically because of your reputation in the veteran community. A reputation I spent years trying to hide." "And now you're trying to profit from acknowledging it," Allison said. "How is that different from what you did before?" "Because this time I'm not lying about your service," Marcus said desperately. "I'm telling them the truth about your achievements, your expertise, your value to any organization working with military personnel. After spending 4 years doing the opposite." Marcus nodded miserably. "I've lost everything, Allison. My business reputation, my marriage, my self-respect. The only thing I have left is the chance to do one thing right. Which is... Step aside, he said simply. I'm withdrawing my firm from the Morrison contract. I'm recommending that they work directly with Richardson Defense, and specifically with you. I'm going to tell them that any marketing strategy for veteran outreach should be developed by someone who actually understands military culture from personal experience. Allison stared at him, searching for the angle, the self-serving motivation behind this apparent sacrifice. Why would you do that? This contract could save your business. Because it's the right thing to do, Marcus said. Because I spent years benefiting from your service, while keeping your achievements hidden. Because veterans deserve better than marketing campaigns, developed by someone who built his career on lies about military families. David leaned forward, his expression skeptical. This is a significant financial sacrifice. What do you gain from walking away? Nothing, Marcus admitted. I gain nothing except the knowledge that I finally did something that honors Allison's service instead of exploiting it. The office fell silent except for the distant hum of air conditioning and street traffic. Allison studied her ex-husband's face, seeing genuine remorse for perhaps the first time since their marriage began falling apart. You understand this won't fix what you did to our marriage, she said finally. I know, Marcus replied. I understand that some damage can't be undone. But maybe I can prevent future damage. Maybe I can make sure other veterans don't have their stories stolen and distorted the way I stole yours. What will you do? David asked. If you withdraw from this contract, what happens to your business? Marcus shrugged with defeat. I'll probably have to close down, find a job working for someone else, start over from scratch. He looked directly at Allison. But maybe that's what I deserve. Maybe starting over will teach me to build something honest this time. Allison felt an unexpected surge of pity for the man who'd caused her so much pain. He looked broken, humbled by the consequences of his deception. But beneath the pity was steel, the same resolve that had carried her through combat deployments and difficult command decisions. You're right, she said firmly. You do deserve to start over. And veterans do deserve better than marketing campaigns built on fabricated military experience. Marcus nodded, seeming to shrink further into himself. But, Allison continued, I have a different proposal. Both men looked at her with surprise. Work for me, she said to Marcus. Not as a partner, not as an equal, but as someone learning to do this work honestly. The Morrison contract will require extensive civilian outreach, and you do have legitimate marketing skills when you're not lying about military service. Marcus's mouth fell open. You want me to work for you? Under very specific conditions, Allison said, her tone commanding. You acknowledge publicly that your previous military marketing was based on fabricated stories about my service. You undergo sensitivity training about veteran issues. You defer to actual military expertise instead of pretending to have knowledge you don't possess. And every piece of marketing material you develop gets approved by me personally. You want to humiliate me professionally, Marcus said, but without anger. I want to rehabilitate you professionally, Allison corrected. I want to turn someone who exploited military service into someone who genuinely serves the veteran community. Consider it a penance. David watched this exchange with fascination. That's either incredibly generous or brilliantly vindictive. It's both, Allison admitted. Marcus destroyed his credibility by lying about military service. This gives him a chance to rebuild it by supporting authentic veteran voices. And it ensures that his marketing skills serve the community he exploited instead of profiting from fabricated military trauma. Marcus looked at her with something approaching awe. You're offering me redemption. I'm offering you work, she corrected. Redemption is something you'll have to earn through honest service to the veteran community, starting with acknowledging publicly what you did to me and why it was wrong. Done, Marcus said immediately. Whatever you need me to say, however you need me to say it. Allison stood and extended her hand across the desk, not as his ex-wife, but as his potential employer. Then let's discuss terms. The Morrison Industries project starts Monday, and we have a lot of work to do. As Marcus shook her hand, Allison felt the final pieces of her new life clicking into place. She was no longer hiding her service or allowing others to define her story. She was Lieutenant Colonel Allison Patterson, combat veteran, Bronze Star recipient, and successful defense contractor who'd turned her greatest betrayal into an opportunity to serve her community with integrity. The woman who'd once been erased was now impossible to ignore. 1 year after the dinner party that changed everything, Allison Patterson stood at the podium of the National Veterans Leadership Conference, looking out at an audience of 500 military personnel, defense contractors, and veteran advocates. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was delivering the keynote address on authentic military marketing at the same conference where Marcus had once hoped to network his way to success. Military service creates a unique bond of trust, she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd earned the right to speak on the subject. When that trust is exploited for commercial gain, when fictional military narratives are created to sell products or services, we don't just harm individual veterans, we damage the credibility of everyone who's worn the uniform. In the third row, Marcus Fleming sat taking careful notes, his recorder app capturing every word. His business cards now read, Senior Marketing Associate, Richardson Defense Veterans Outreach, instead of CEO, Fleming Marketing Solutions. The demotion and title reflected a promotion in integrity. The past year had been transformative for both of them, though in vastly different ways. Marcus had followed through on every commitment he'd made in Allison's office. He'd published a detailed confession on LinkedIn, acknowledging his years of fabricating military spouse narratives and apologizing specifically to Allison and the broader military community. The post had gone viral, generating thousands of comments ranging from forgiveness to fury. When I hired my ex-husband to work under my supervision, Allison continued from the podium, people questioned my judgment. They assumed I was either being vindictive or naive. But rehabilitation requires accountability, and accountability requires facing the communities you've harmed. Marcus had indeed faced those communities. As part of his rehabilitation, Allison had required him to attend veteran support groups, not as a facilitator, but as someone learning to understand the experiences he'd previously exploited. The sessions had broken him down completely before building him back up with genuine empathy. The Morrison Industries project had been their first major collaboration, and it had set the template for their working relationship. Marcus developed marketing strategies, while Allison provided military expertise and final approval. Every campaign was reviewed by focus groups of actual veterans, ensuring authenticity at every level. Authentic military marketing isn't about using the right terminology or displaying the correct flags, Allison explained to her audience. It's about understanding that behind every uniform is a human being with complex experiences that can't be reduced to convenient narratives or emotional manipulation. The success of their work had been undeniable. The Morrison campaign had increased veteran enrollment in their transition programs by 40%, while maintaining the highest satisfaction ratings in company history. Other defense contractors had taken notice, leading to a steady stream of projects that kept Richardson Defense's Veteran Outreach Division fully booked. But the professional success was less important to Allison than the personal transformation she'd witnessed in Marcus. The arrogant businessman who'd once silenced her military stories had become someone who actively elevated veteran voices in every project. He'd learned to ask questions instead of making assumptions, to research respectfully instead of appropriating experiences. My ex-husband is here tonight, Allison said, causing a ripple of surprise through the audience. Marcus shifted uncomfortably as heads turned toward him. A year ago, he was profiting from fabricated stories about military service. Tonight, he's part of a team that's helping hundreds of veterans tell their own authentic stories. The transformation hadn't been easy. Marcus had lost most of his original clients when news of his deception spread through the business community. His divorce had cost him financially, and his public confession had damaged relationships with friends and family who couldn't understand why he'd chosen professional suicide over quietly moving on. But working under Allison's guidance had given him something he'd never possessed during his years of deception: genuine expertise. He'd learned to recognize the difference between military branches by their customs and traditions, not just their uniforms. He'd studied deployment cycles, understood the challenges of veteran reintegration, and developed marketing approaches that honored military service instead of exploiting it. Redemption isn't a destination, Allison continued. It's a daily choice to do better than you did yesterday. My ex-husband made a choice to face his mistakes rather than run from them, and that choice has benefited countless veterans who now receive authentic, respectful outreach instead of manipulative marketing based on fabricated military trauma. In the audience, Katherine Richardson dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. She'd become one of Allison's closest friends over the past year, bonding over their shared commitment to supporting military families. David had promoted Allison to Director of Veteran Affairs, making her one of the youngest department heads in company history. The speech concluded to thunderous applause, and Allison felt the same satisfaction she'd once experienced after successfully completing a difficult mission. She'd taken her worst betrayal and transformed it into her greatest professional triumph, creating authentic programs that served the veteran community while proving that even the most damaged relationships could be rebuilt on foundations of honesty. During the networking reception that followed, Marcus approached her with his usual deference. Their professional relationship had evolved into something resembling friendship, though it would never again be the intimate partnership of marriage. "Outstanding speech," he said. The response from the audience was incredible. "Thank you," Allison replied. How did the veteran focus group react to the preliminary materials for the Henderson project? They loved the authenticity, Marcus reported. Several participants commented that it was the first military marketing campaign they'd seen that didn't make them cringe. Johnson, the Marine veteran from Detroit, said it was the first time he'd seen his deployment experience represented accurately in civilian marketing. Allison nodded with satisfaction. Veteran approval had become their gold standard, the metric by which they measured every project's success. Marcus had learned to value that approval more than profit margins or client satisfaction scores. "There's something else," Marcus said hesitantly. "I've been offered a position with Veteran Voices Media. They want me to head their new authentic marketing division." The news should have pleased her, but Allison felt an unexpected pang of loss. Marcus had become an effective team member, someone whose reformed perspective added value to their projects. His departure would require her to train someone new in the specific approach they'd developed. "That's a significant opportunity," she said carefully. "What would you be doing?" "Training other marketing professionals to work respectfully with military communities," Marcus explained. "Teaching them to recognize and avoid the mistakes I made. It would be based on everything I've learned working under your supervision." The irony was perfect. Marcus Fleming, who'd once built his career on fabricated military narratives, would now teach others to avoid the same deceptions. His public failure and rehabilitation had made him uniquely qualified to guide other marketers away from exploitative practices. "You should take it," Allison said firmly. "The veteran community needs people who understand the damage that inauthentic marketing can cause. You've learned those lessons the hard way." Marcus looked surprised by her support. "You're not upset that I'd be leaving Richardson Defense?" "I'm proud that you'd be taking what you've learned here and using it to help the broader community," she replied honestly. "That's exactly what redemption looks like." As the reception wound down, Allison found herself reflecting on the year's journey. She'd reclaimed her identity, rebuilt her career, and transformed her greatest betrayal into meaningful service to the veteran community. The woman who'd once hidden her Bronze Star in an attic box was now a nationally recognized expert on authentic military outreach. Marcus had also transformed, evolving from someone who exploited military service for personal gain into someone dedicated to protecting veterans from similar exploitation. His redemption wasn't complete. That would take years of continued service, but his commitment to authentic military advocacy was genuine. Walking to her car after the conference, Allison passed a billboard advertising a local veteran services organization. The marketing was clean, respectful, and clearly developed by someone who understood military culture from personal experience. It was the kind of authentic outreach that was becoming more common, as the industry learned to value genuine expertise over fabricated credibility. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer. "Saw the live stream of your speech. Dad would have been so proud to see you honored for your service instead of hiding it." Their father had passed away 6 months earlier, his Alzheimer's finally claiming the memories he'd struggled to retain. But in his final lucid moments, he'd seen Allison's Bronze Star displayed in her new condo and smiled with recognition and pride. "My soldier girl," he'd whispered, remembering the daughter who'd served with honor even when others had tried to erase that service. Driving home through the city lights, Allison thought about the dinner party that had started this entire journey. The evening that had seemed like her greatest humiliation had actually been her liberation, forcing her to confront years of complicity in her own erasure and choose authenticity over comfort. Marcus's lies had been devastating, but they'd also been revelatory. They'd shown her how thoroughly she'd allowed herself to be diminished, how completely she'd accepted being reduced to a supporting character in someone else's version of her story. Never again. Lieutenant Colonel Allison Patterson, combat veteran, Bronze Star recipient, and Director of Veteran Affairs, pulled into her parking garage with the satisfaction of someone who'd not only reclaimed her identity, but used it to serve others facing similar struggles. The woman who'd once been silenced now had a platform to amplify authentic military voices. The wife who'd been erased had become a leader who ensured other veterans' stories were heard and honored. Her service to her country had ended, but her service to her fellow veterans was just beginning, and this time, no one would be able to silence her or steal her story. The real Allison Patterson was finally fully visible, and she was impossible to ignore. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.